After spending 23 years behind bars for a crime he says he did not commit, my next guest was just released from jail and a murder indictment against him thrown out. So while Lawrence Simmons and his family have cause to celebrate, the people of Paterson, New Jersey can still recall all the disturbing details of the murder of one of their beloved doctors. In May 1977, David Doctor was called out of bed late one evening to answer an emergency call at a nearby hospital. When he stepped outside his home and approached his car, he was robbed and brutally beaten to death by assailants wielding a metal pipe. Lawrence Simmons and two other men were quickly arrested and charged with the crime. Simmons, who insisted he is innocent, was tried and convicted. But in 1995, a judge granted Simmons a new trial. He was tried again, but this time around the jury was not as convinced of his guilt, resulting in a mistrial. Prosecutors refused to let go and tried the case for the third time in 1998, but were yet again unsuccessful. A mistrial. Lawrence Simmons, my guest today, would have been out long before if he just copped a plea, but he refused, and now over 2 decades later, a judge has dismissed the murder indictment against Simmons and told the prosecutors to pack it in. Joining Mr. Simmons is one of his attorneys, John Vincent Saykanic. Also here in CourtTV Studio A, another attorney for Simmons, Miles Feinstein, and in our newsroom, a prosecutor on the case, Stephen Brizik. Welcome to you all. Lawrence, let me start with you. When I read through the notes on this case, you said that you walked up on the murder of Dr. Doctor.
No.
You didn't say hey to the two guys?
No, that was a mistake. That was not the doctor's. This was another mugging of a man named George Marshall.
Okay, so you say you had nothing to do, were never there. Why did the co-defendant rat on you?
Because he was told by the detectives who was in charge of this case that I gave a statement against him, and that if he didn't give a statement against me, that he would be going to jail for the rest of his life. So the best thing for him to do was to give a statement against me, and that they would give him an OR bail, and he would walk away with no time at all.
And what happened to him?
Well, they gave him immunity from prosecution. He testified, and after he testified, they let him walk free.
Okay. Now, he recanted that testimony in the second trial, but then in the third trial said, no, I really was always telling the truth, that Lawrence Simmons was involved. What's been going on?
Well, he's since been arrested for several other crimes, and they needed him for his testimony in my second and my third trial. So after my second trial, he recanted. But in the third trial, he was facing more time in prison, so they made a deal with him to testify against the state, so he flip-flopped back to the state.
All right. Well, John, what it's come down to now, the Court of Appeals just said after 2 mistrials, 23 years in prison, if he's innocent, this has been a tragedy. If he's guilty, he's done his time. You're not going to retry this again. So it was just sort of a bizarre resolution where no one is really satisfied.
But we maintain that Mr. Simmons is innocent. There were no positive identifications by any witness, no DNA evidence, no scientific evidence, no physical evidence, nothing except the word of David Wilson, who got immunity. And he's an admitted perjurer. He testified at the second trial that he admitted to the perjury. There's nothing else. The prosecutor who tried the case said without the testimony of David Wilson, the case could not have even gotten to a jury. It wouldn't have even survived a motion for judgment of acquittal. Mr. Simmons maintained his innocence on the night of the arrest, more than 23 years ago. He has maintained it every day since. He's been writing, I'm innocent, I'm innocent. He was offered a plea 5 years ago at the time served. He wouldn't do it. He said he'd rather spend the rest of his life in prison than to admit to something he didn't do. He maintains his innocence, and our position is that he is innocent.
All right, Stephen, prosecuting this case has got to be very difficult. If you wanted to appeal and pursue it further, it looks like the court's trying to shut you down. What do you do next?
Well, at this point, the Passaic County Prosecutor's Office has decided that the best resolution of the matter is to let the matter rest at this point without further appeals on our part. Everyone likes to leave the field of battle as Grant, victorious, but the challenge is to leave it as Lee did, with dignity and with grace, having the spirit and the drive to continue, but knowing that the best resolution of the matter, the act of statesmanship, is to let the matter rest and not to pursue it any further.
Okay, well, that's all great, whether we're talking about military or sports, but we're talking about somebody's life here. And you've got the testimony of one co-defendant that basically indicted this man. That testimony was recanted, and he was retried again even after that. Any second guessing on your part whether that was an appropriate action?
Well, actually, there's in any case, anything of significance, whether it's an military engagement or a criminal trial. There's the core truth of the matter and the folklore which builds up around the case. The truth of the matter is that in addition to David Wilson's testimony, there were 5 different people who identified photographs of Lawrence Simmons, either through a lineup, through seeing his photograph in the newspaper the morning of his arrest, or through seeing him in court, who were able to say that either that was the person who they observed committing the mugging of George Marshall or just coming upon the scene seconds before the killing of Dr. Doctor. They were able to say either it was he or one of the 3 that they saw, or he looked very similar to the person that they saw that particular morning. And when you consider the testimony of David Wilson being corroborated by 5 additional people, what you have there is what you look for when you're trying a criminal case. Perhaps eyewitness testimony of a co-defendant, yes, but some corroboration. Here you have 5 additional witnesses.
What about the 2 mistrials, however, where a jury basically hung up? They obviously weren't satisfied with the 5 + 1, 6 witnesses putting him there.
Well, in the first retrial, we have to remember that Mr. Simmons was reconvicted of the robbery of George Marshall that took place 4 blocks and 45 minutes after the murder of Dr. Doctor. That is one of those core truths that is often forgotten when the folklore of the case is being discussed. So what we have is a jury in 1996 recertifying the conviction of 1977 with respect to the robbery of George Marshall, but 8 out of 4, although they were convinced that Mr. Simmons was guilty of the murder as well, could not convince the remaining 4 to go along with them. So that was 8-4 for conviction in 1996 on the murder, and it was 9-3 for conviction on the murder in the retrial in 1998. That is a rather significant way of looking at the case, because over a period of 23 years, you have 29 jurors concluding that Mr. Simmons is guilty and 7 concluding that he was not. If you add the 12 jurors who convicted Donald Phillips, the co-defendant, on substantially the same evidence, you have 41 jurors who signed off on the evidence in this case as persuasive, compelling, and justifying findings of guilt with respect to these 3 men.
Okay, Miles, let me ask you about action that you're contemplating on Lawrence Simmons' behalf, whether it's against the state, the law enforcement community, prosecutors. When you listen to something like that from Stephen, the man who has pursued the prosecution, it's not a question of your client having been exonerated by DNA evidence or others, but the court simply saying he's been tried enough.
The fact is that he is presumed and assumed to be innocent. He, in fact, has maintained his innocence, and a dismissal means that that presumption stays with him and he is innocent. Mr. Britt.
All right, we're going to have to fix the microphone problems you got there, Miles. We're going to come right back to you on that. Lawrence, you just heard the comments from Stephen Brisick that there were 5 other people who put you there at the scene that say you were involved in all of this. How do you get a community now, even if you're never tried again, to believe you're innocent?
These 5 people that Mr. Brisick is talking about, neither one of them made a positive identification. They always stated that I resemble the man that they've seen. And even though I was at the police station that night, the detectives had brought people in who had seen people that night, just hours, from the time that this incident occurred. And they stated, and they walked right up to me, and they stated that they could not identify me and say that I was the man that they've seen that night.
Okay. What about the fact that you denied knowing the 2 co-defendants, and yet you certainly knew one of their sisters? You knew them in the neighborhood, whether they were great buddies or not, but...
When I stated that I didn't know them, I stated that I didn't know them personally. Like if I seen you, I may not know you, your husband, your family, or your personal life. I may have seen them on the street, but I do not know them personally. I did not deny knowing them or seeing them that night. I just told the detective that I don't know them, and that I was not with them. And the prosecutor star witness, David Wilson, he even stated to the detectives, he didn't even know my name. They told him my name. They told him who I was at the police station. He didn't know me.
Okay. What do you do with a case like this, John? Because there are certainly precedents now for you to pursue lawsuits on his behalf, but you've got a tough box here.
Correct. Robert T. Pickett, we're negotiating with him about handling the civil rights violation case. I just want to state one thing. There was no positive identification of Mr. Simmons, and there's a lot more to this case than meets the eye. The police investigation in this case was very deeply flawed. There was a lot of police misconduct. I'm not saying this. Mr. Simmons isn't saying this. David Wilson isn't saying this. The prosecutor who tried the case in 1977 left the prosecutor's office, went in private practice. He testified at the reconstruction hearings and the recantation hearings. And this is a quote, because I don't want to misquote anybody. The police were lazy and were not completely open and forthright with him as to what they did on the investigation, unquote. Now,
okay, now he was talking about the fact they didn't reveal that they'd given a polygraph to one of the co-defendants.
That's one of the things.
But he emphasized over and over again that they didn't follow up and that they were lazy. When you talk about misconduct, it's not somebody sort of beating someone in a back room that we're talking about. It's not revealing information to the prosecutor's office.
Correct.
Okay.
But there was also an anonymous telephone call on June 8th, 1977, saying 2 of the men were right, not him, but there was 2 other people, and they gave the names. No investigation was done by the detectives. This is before the trial. And the prosecutor at the time, this is another quote, the better route would have been to at least check it out. If I were handling the case as a detective,
sure,
I certainly would have checked it out, unquote.
Yeah.
The police also released up to 11 other people who were in the area, possible suspects, before these men were brought in. It was just a poorly done investigation. That's the point. He's maintaining his innocence. There was no positive identification as to the homicide. There wasn't. That's a misstatement of the record. There was no positive ID.
Okay, let me go to Stephen then, because I don't think you would intentionally misstate the record.
The identifications were varied, as I indicated. The robbery victim, George Marshall, makes a positive identification. He sees the defendants in the newspaper the next day. He recognizes them immediately. He sees a lineup. He's able to pick out photographs of the photograph of Simmons. He sees him in court, and he says he looks just like the guy who mugged him on May 27, 1977. You have someone who sees Lawrence Simmons moments before the murder of Dr. Doctor takes place, and she is able to identify his picture from the newspaper the next morning. She saves the newspaper. She doesn't show it to anyone until the prosecutor stopped by a few months later when they're preparing the case. She produces it, and she shows that the fellow she's pointing to is the fellow she remembers walking by her home seconds before the homicide would have occurred. She can't say positively that is he, but when you combine her testimony with the identifications that occurred down the street 45 minutes later and the other factors in the case, you have a circumstantial evidence case that is rather compelling. And there's one additional witness in 1977 who probably made a big difference in the finding of the jury with respect to Mr. Simmons' guilt, and that was Mr. Simmons' testimony. He testified in 1977, and he buried himself, because his testimony was even contrary to the testimony of the sister of Donald Phillips, his co-defendant. The defendant placed himself in a location his co-defendant's sister would not place him. The details that Donald Phillips' sister gave with respect to the incidents that occurred just prior to the homicide did not square with Lawrence Simmons' testimony, and his testimony was such a disaster that it contributed materially to his conviction back in 1977. So if I had to cite one of the most important witnesses that the conviction was based upon in 1977, I would have to list Lawrence Simmons as
okay, we're going to have to take a break. I think we've got Miles Feinstein's microphone fixed. We'll get a chat with him right after this. Don't go away.
If someone was to kill or murder someone close to me, I would want that person, to be punished for it. But I would not want an innocent person to be in prison and suffer and become a victim. And just like the doctor's family is a victim, I am a victim.